Book of Enoch provides a fascinating bridge between the world of the Hebrew Bible and the world of its source narratives from out of ancient Sumer, Babylonia, Arcadia, and Assyria. In the Mesopotamian sources, there are some fascinating narratives which I believe point to ancient memories of paleocontact. And these themes are also there in the Hebrew scriptures, but not as developed and not as overt in the top layer of the story, by which I mean that final redaction of the Hebrew scriptures in the 8th to 6th centuries BCE was really aimed at eradicating the sense of similarity and fellow feeling between the worlds of the Elohim of the Hebrew Bible and the worlds of the Anunnaki, of the Babylonian and Sumerian, etc. stories. The connections are there, it's hard to miss them, but they're only mentioned very curtly in the final redaction of the Hebrew Bible. One example would be the descent of the gods from the heavens, the descent of the powerful beings from the skies, from space. It's there in the Babylonian story of origins, the Enuma Elish, which begins with the words, "when in the heights," and it's also there in Genesis 1, with the arrival of the Elohim in their ruach in the sky, hovering in the dark skies over the flood waters of a devastated planet. So the connections are there. Another correlation would be in the 7th tablet of the Enuma Elish. We hear the reference to Ashuri, the one who brought the gift of agriculture to humanity in the deep past. Now, the translator has wanted to say, oh, this may be a reference to Marduk, but that's not clear at all. Ashuri is the name or title of the one who brings agriculture. It's mentioned very briefly in passing, so this could even be a blind motif, where the Enuma Elish has included something that is in common parlance without understanding what it really means or what the source of it is. Ashuri, the one who brings agriculture, gets mentioned in the Hebrew scriptures as well in a similar fashion, only in the Hebrew scriptures, Ashuri is Asherah. The final redaction of the Hebrew scriptures has wanted to write out a fuller understanding of who Asherah was, and yet in the book of Jeremiah, the cult of Asherah was so strong that she was honored on every high hill and under every green tree, from every fortified town to every garrison city. That's how important the commemoration of Asherah was in pre-Reformed Judaism. And it's a crossover point between the Hebrew telling of human origins and the Babylonian telling of human origins. Not developed, but there is this reference to positive interventions made by powerful beings. It's never quite explained exactly what they were. We're just told they came from the heavens. In the Enuma Elish, we're told that they were powerful beings. In the Hebrew scriptures, part of an airborne army or a sky fleet or a star fleet. This is the phrase that Seva Hashemayim that we find in the Hebrew. The hybridization story in the Mesopotamian canon, in which the observers, the Igigi, crossbreed with human females, that is very lightly referenced in Genesis 6, the stories of the Bene Elohim, seeing the daughters of men were beautiful and coming and taking them as their wives, breeding with them and then producing the giants, the men of renown. And it's very interesting that this is historicized by Josephus when he makes reference to these ancient stories in Genesis 6. And he says, of course, the evidence for that is the giants in the present day. These were the titans of Greek legend, he says. And he's pointing back to this story that correlates between the Mesopotamian telling and the biblical telling. It's told very curtly in Genesis 6, as if the writer assumes we know the story from somewhere else. But where would we know it from? It's the book of Enoch that develops that story further, but it wasn't written until 300 years after Genesis reached its current form in the 6th century BCE. And I say all this as if it's absolutely cut and dried, but what I'm saying about the formation of the Hebrew Scriptures really is the broad scholarly consensus at present. In the Mesopotamian narratives, we have the stories of people being taken up into space. So one example would be in the myth of Adapa, which was a story that we dug up in cuneiform tablets in the country that today is Iraq. And we believe that this story was produced nearly 4,000 years ago in about 1800 BCE. There's another very light reference in the Sumerian Kings list, which was written a little bit more than 4,000 years ago in the late 3rd millennium BCE. And that's the story of King Etana, who gets taken up into the heavens, or what we would call the skies, into space. So here are these narratives of people being taken by advanced non-human beings up into space, just a very light reference that you could almost miss in the biblical narrative. And it surrounds the character of Enoch, who in Genesis 5, we are told, walked with the powerful ones until he was no longer seen on earth because the powerful ones took him away. The Book of Enoch gives the backstory to that and gives the backstory to the hybridizations of Genesis 6 to give us a bit more detail as to what happens. And when the writer did that in the 3rd century BCE, the sources he is appealing to are Mesopotamian sources. One of the clues for that is in the counting system. The Hebrew counting system is not rooted in base 60. That was the mathematical calendar language of the Sumerians, and it finds its way into the Book of Enoch. Now, the Book of Enoch is a book strangely out of time, because in that final redaction that gathered together the Hebrew Scriptures, scissors and pasted them, edited them, rewrote them to produce the Hebrew canon as we know it, that was done between the 8th and 6th centuries BCE. And one of the agendas of those writers was to diminish any sense of fellow feeling or family feeling with the Mesopotamian stories. So those aspects of the Hebrew stories that seem to be polytheistic, or what I would call a canon of paleocontact, they were really airbrushed over, they were diminished so that the figures of Asher and Milcom and Dagon, Chemosh, they were all diminished so that the readers of the New Hebrew Canon would think, well, these are just totems, these are just idols, these are just ideas. And the notion that these were other elohim alongside Yahweh had to be pushed right down, because their agenda was to turn Judaism into a canon of Yahwist monotheism. Yahweh was the only real Elohim, all the others were imagined. That's really the picture they're wanting to present. And so they're not wanting to show the Hebrew stories as part of a wider family of stories talking about a whole plethora of advanced beings. So that redaction takes the Hebrew Scriptures over here to put some clear blue water between them and the stories of ancient Sumer and Babylonia and Arcadia and Assyria. But then 300 years later, the writer of the Ethiopic Book of Enoch, that's the Book of Enoch that's included in the Ethiopian canon of the Bible, this writer comes along and he writes something here that draws on the Mesopotamian stories as a way of unpacking things mentioned only briefly in the Hebrew Scriptures. And it's really for that reason that the Book of Enoch didn't make its way into the Hebrew canon, because it was kind of doing the opposite of what the redactors had intended. So that's how it became the banned book. Although it was never really banned, it just wasn't included in the canon of the Hebrew Scriptures other than in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Kudos to them. So that's why in Enoch we find themes not further developed in the Hebrew scriptures. It was the whole reason Enoch was written, to bridge those families of narratives and to unpack the aspects of ET interventions, hybridization, spaceflight stories, Sumerian maths, and cosmology. So put simply, it wasn't included in the main canons because it was too Mesopotamian in its worldview. But when we read Genesis 6 today, and its references to external interventions and hybridization, the writer seems to assume we know this story from somewhere else. Can't be from the Book of Enoch because it came later. He must have assumed that we knew these stories from their Mesopotamian sources, or that those stories had survived in the grassroots knowledge of the Hebrew people. And that is clearly what Jeremiah is saying when he explains how hard they had to work to stamp that knowledge and those commemorations out of Jewish knowledge and Jewish practice. As to the Christian New Testament, when Jude wants to refer back to the Enoch of Genesis 6, he quotes verbatim from the Book of Enoch. So he assumes Christians are reading the Book of Enoch, and the writer of Genesis 6 seems to assume his readers know the Mesopotamian family of stories from which Genesis 6 proceeds. And this is why the Bible makes so much better sense when we read it in its proper context, in the family of narratives of which it is a part and from which it has proceeded. So today I want to read some sections from the Ethiopic Book of Enoch and show you some parallels, show you how it reaches to Genesis on one hand and to the Enuma Elish and the Atrahasis story on the other, bridging the two worlds. 1 Enoch. Enoch was a righteous man whose eyes were opened by God, saw the vision of the Holy One in the heavens, which the angels showed me, not for this generation, but for a remote one, which is to come. I mentioned how Enoch fits into the scheme of Etana and Adapa being taken up into the heavens. The name Enoch means the initiated one. Chapter 6. And it came to pass when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come, let us choose wives from among the children of men, and beget us children. And Senjaza was their leader. In all, 200 descended in the days of Jared on the summit of Mount Hermon. These are the names of their leaders. Samlazaz, their leader, Arakoba, Ramael, Kokablel, Tamlet, Ramlel, Danel, Ezekiel, Barakijal, Asael, Amoros, Batalel, Ananel, Zachiel, Zamasapil, Satarel, Turel, Jonjael, Sariel. These are their chiefs of tens. And all the others together with them took unto themselves wives, and each chose for himself one. Well, this gives us just a little bit more detail about who came and what they did, unpacks a little bit of Genesis 6 that just calls all these beings the Bene Elohim, the sons of the powerful ones. It's interesting how the story starts. When the children of men multiplied in those days. So the Book of Enoch has used the same phrase that we find in Genesis 6, which says this: When men began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the Bene Elohim saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. That way of beginning a story with a when this happened is a Mesopotamian form. it begins with a temporal phrase and very often with the word when. So we've heard it in the Book of Enoch, we've heard it in Genesis. It's there in the Enuma Elish, when in the heights. In Genesis 2, the origin story begins when Yahweh made the earth and the heavens. In the 6th chapter of 1st Enoch, when it came to pass in these days that the children of men began to multiply. Genesis 6, when men began to increase in number on the earth. And it could be argued it's there in Genesis 1 as well, which begins with a temporal phrase, when in the beginning the powerful ones created. And so the stories roll on. And so we're looking at the same form of literature. When in the heights, when the humans began to multiply, when men increased in number, when Yahweh, the Elohim, created. It is a story of origins that belongs in a wider family. And Enoch does the same, it's part of the same family. The writer in the 3rd century BCE is wanting to say, look, what I'm producing is in the same family of stories of origins. Back to the Book of Enoch, chapter 7. And all the others together with them took unto themselves wives, and each chose for himself one. And they taught them charms and enchantments, and the cutting of roots, made them acquainted with plants, and they became pregnant, and they bare great giants, whose height was 3,000 ells, who consumed all the acquisitions of men. So the problem, according to the Book of Enoch, begins when the giants, the offspring of the visitors, start competing for resources with human beings, and it leads to conflicts, it leads to theft. But it begins as a story of a positive intervention, the teaching of what we might interpret as medicine and other things besides, because Enoch continues. Chapter 8, and Azazel taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, and made known to them the metals of the earth and the art of working with them, and bracelets and ornaments, and the use of antimony, and the beautifying of the eyelids, and all kinds of costly stones, and all colouring tinctures. They're teaching them fashion, they're teaching them makeup. So this is quite a rich and peaceable cultural exchange in the beginning. So Jaza taught enchantments and root cuttings, Amaros the resolving of enchantments, Barakijal taught astrology or cosmology, Kokabel the constellations, Ezekiel the knowledge of the clouds, Arachiel the signs of the earth, Shamsiel the signs of the sun, and Sariel the course of the moon. So this aspect of a rich tutelage is there in the Book of Enoch, and it harkens back to what we've heard in the Enuma Elish and the Artrahasis stories. It's there also in the Greek Babylonian story of Oannes and the Apkallu, in which these advanced others come and they teach our ancestors mathematics, writing, legal systems, record keeping, civil engineering, agriculture, and all the accoutrements, says the writer Berossus, of civilization. And the parallel is there in the Artrahasis tablet as well, where we're told that Enlil did these things. Tablet 1 says, Enlil showed them the way to smelt iron and to work steel, and they took up the metal implements from the ash pile, and from these they produced new picks and spades to utilize, to dig long channels, and to provide food and please the gods. So all this is sounding rather familiar. The Book of Enoch is taking those themes and telling them in the context of a book that is purportedly giving greater detail to the Hebrew stories of Genesis 6. So he goes on. And then Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel looked down from heaven and saw much blood being shed on the earth. And they said to one another, let us bring our cause before the Most High. El Elyon, of course, means the powerful one higher than the other powerful ones. So again, it assumes this plurality of Elohim, this plurality of beings that are being supervised by an individual. It's here in Enoch, it's there in the Atrahasis and the Enuma-Elish as well. Then said the Most High, the Holy and Great One, spake, and sent Uriel to the son of Lamech, and said to him, Go to Noah, and tell him in my name, hide thyself, and reveal to him the end that is approaching, that the whole earth will be destroyed, and a deluge is about to come upon the whole earth, and will destroy all that is on it. Now instruct him, that he may escape, and his seed may be preserved for all the generations of the world. Now the reader of the Hebrew Bible would say, yes, this is the backstory to the story of the flood in Genesis 6. But it's also a repeat of what we find in the Atrahasis tablet. So again, it's bridging the two. It's giving a version of the story that sounds rather more like the Babylonian telling. This is the preamble to the flood, the deluge, in the Atrahasis tablet. Humans gathered together in towns. They ate their bread, drank their beer, and had offspring, and their numbers became more and more, greater by far. 600 years, not even 600 years went by. The inhabited lands sprawled, and the people grew plentiful, and the inhabited lands raised a howl like a bellowing bull. But the god was annoyed by all the noise that the humans made. Enlil had to put up with all of their loud clamour and clatter, and he raised his voice to be heard, speaking to the high gods. The noise which is made by the humans has become too great. All of this clamour and clatter has kept me from my sleep. Therefore command an outbreak of the shivering disease. And thus the divine Namtara was summoned by the gods and unleashed the shivering disease. All of the people were beset by the plague outbreak. There was one man among them who was named Atrahasis, and he heeded diligently to the words spoken by his god Enki. Atrahasis raised his voice to be heard, speaking to his lord, How long are we going to be beset by this terrible disease? Well, following the shivering disease, the powerful beings decide they'll try another tactic, food scarcity. Now let us make it so the humans will be denied their food, so that the harvests will not be great enough to cure their hunger. Cause the winds to be unleashed and rage, denuding the soil. Let there be clouds aloft in the sky, but which bring no rain, so the farmers' fields will yield hardly any crop to speak of, so that their lives will be wretched and filled with misery. Any reader of Genesis 3 recognizes this theme where food scarcity is a punishment inflicted upon the humans by the God character because they become too numerous and because they become fertile. It's part of the punishment that's inflicted by the Yahweh character in Genesis 3. And they are being denied access to the healing botanicals, the leaves of the tree of life, which heal them, and so they're going to get sick. So this theme of sickness and mortality and food scarcity, they are echoes there between Genesis 3 and the Atrahasis. Now here's another crossover. Let us constrict the birth channel so as to deny a prosperous birth. Another punishment mentioned in Genesis 3, where the birthing of children is going to become more difficult and much more painful. So the themes are repeating. Tablet 2. Enlil convened a congress, speaking to his children, the gods. On the first day, he's announcing his plan, the tempest will rise, blowing in an awful fury, unleashing the dreaded flood weapon, and rage like a war. The explosive annihilation weapon will descend over the people who will lose sight of one another in the sheets of pouring rain. Even the gods will be alarmed by the full force of the flood, and every man and woman will have been reduced to clay. You know the land is full, and how much the humans have multiplied, and how we've been so annoyed by all the noise they make. And so the Congress decided in favor of the flood, which Enlil desired. And so this is a very clear crossover story. The flood narrative of Atrahasis, the flood narrative of Enoch, the flood narrative of Genesis 6. And it's after this that Enoch describes his experience of going up into the sky. Chapter 12. And I, Enoch, was blessing the Lord of Majesty and the King of the ages, and lo, the watchers called me, Enoch the scribe. And the vision was shown me thus. Behold, in the vision, clouds invited me, and a mist summoned me, and the course of the stars and the lightning sped and hastened me, and the winds and the vision caused me to fly, and lifted me upward, and bore me into heaven. Bore him into heaven, carried him up into the sky. The same narrative as Adapa, the same narrative as King Etana. And I went in till I drew nigh to a wall which is built of crystals. So a transparent wall, something Enoch had never seen before. And we have a very similar description of the transparent canopy of the craft given by Ezekiel in his book. I drew nigh to a wall built of crystals and surrounded by tongues of fire, and it began to affright me. And I went into the tongues of fire and drew nigh to a large house, which was built of crystals, and the walls of the house were like a tessellated floor made of crystals, and its groundwork was of crystal. Its ceiling was like the path of the stars and the lightnings, and between them were fiery cherubim. Aren't we being shown the stars of space and fiery craft moving through them? And their heaven was clear as water. A flaming fire surrounded the walls, and its portals blazed with fire. And I entered into that house, and it was hot as fire and cold as ice. There were no delights of life therein. Fear covered me, and trembling got hold upon me. And as I quaked and trembled, I fell upon my face, and I beheld a vision. And lo, there was a second house, greater than the former, and the entire portal stood open before me, as if it was built of flames of fire. Enoch then goes on to describe what he saw, and it's very clear that we are in the realm of apocalyptic literature. And what that means is that the writer has seen things that he's really struggled to understand, and so he's going to do his best to describe what he saw and allow us to interpret what these things are. And when it comes to the section I just read, that's really very helpful. Ezekiel does the same thing, because with a modern mind, we can read what the two writers describe and say, oh, I think I know what it is you're describing. But in the chapters that follow, it's very clear that the writer is trying to interpret what is being shown. And so his understanding of the movement of the planets and of the sun and the moon are, let's just say, not modern cosmology. And on top of his interpretation of what is being shown, he's then going to reach for a religious therefore at the end of it, a religious implication at the end of it. And so he continues through the chapters. We get to chapter 72, the book of the heavenly luminaries. Enoch says, the book of the courses of the luminaries of the heaven, the revelations of each according to their classes, their dominion and their seasons, according to their names and places of origin, and according to their months, which Uriel, the holy angel who was with me, who was their guide, showed me. He then shows how calendar mathematics relates to the movement of the sun and the moon and the earth. In like manner, he says, 12 doors Uriel showed me, open in the circumference of the sun's chariot in the heaven, through which the rays of the sun break forth. Doors and chariots are not our modern understanding of the movement of objects through space. Clearly, Enoch is trying to describe by analogy what he is seeing, and his analogies may fall slightly short. So it's worth saying that what he saw and what he says he saw might be two slightly different things. And it reminds us that what he's writing is not science. It is what we call apocalyptic literature. And the book continues with visions for Enoch and Noah and Methuselah. But as we go through the later chapters, it's very clear that the writer really is wanting to share these stories and interpret them through a Hebrew worldview. And so the themes of divine wrath, sin and righteousness, reward and punishment, condemnation and execution all begin to heighten as the chapters continue. So that in chapter 92 he says, "And when sin and unrighteousness and blasphemy and violence in all kinds of deeds increase, and apostasy and transgression and uncleanness increase, and great chastisement shall come from heaven upon all of these, and all the idols of the heathen shall be abandoned, and the temples burned with fire, and they shall remove them from the whole earth." So he is really echoing themes in another apocalyptic abductee story, the story of Ezekiel, where he's saying that the commemoration of these other beings must now be seen as idolatry, and there must be a big cleanup. So in Ezekiel, there's a punishment threatened for any family that won't show open grief at the fact that the Tzeva HaShamayim are commemorated in the Jerusalem temple. And these weapons, the Keli Mashato and the Keli Mapaso, will be used against a whole district to cleanse it of all those families in that category. They want to pare Judaism down to this memory of Yahweh, the only Elohim, and all the others are just idols. And so this theme in Ezekiel is here also in Enoch. So though I said Enoch kind of runs in the opposite direction to that final redaction, wanting to airbrush these stories out, by the time we get to the end of Enoch, Enoch is showing you don't have to be worried about what I said earlier. I really am very orthodox Hebrew writer. I really am a loyal Yahwist. And this is the therefore that I reach at the end of my book. It wasn't quite enough to get the Book of Enoch into the canon, but it does show that his intention is to fit these themes within the meta-narrative of monotheistic Judaism. So what we have in the Book of Enoch is a mixture of things. We've got an experience that he's tried to describe to us. Experiences that he's interpreted through a pre-existing theological lens, and then his interpretation and spin on the whole thing through which he brings his religious message to his audience. So there's a lot going on in the book, and if someone ever asks me, do I take the Book of Enoch as history? Is it an historical account of paleo-contact? I have to say, well, it's not that simple. I don't take it as history, but I do think there's history in it. And let me make an analogy. In 1561, there was a mass sighting of something over the skies of Nuremberg. And a local writer, Hans Glaser, wrote up an account of what happened, describing it as best he could by analogy, because the things they were seeing in the sky were things they'd never seen before. So the only way he could describe it was by analogy. And then he was helped out by an artist. There's a woodblock print in the paper as well, trying to depict what happened. So he describes this thing, does his best to describe it by analogy, and then at the end, his therefore, his take-home messages. So I think really we better all make sure we're right with God and we're doing the right thing, because there's a whole lot of crazy shit happening in the skies right now. And in a way, Enoch does something very similar. So in Hans Glaser, we've got reportage, we've got eyewitness experience, interpreted, and then with a religious spin placed on it through his existing theology. I think Enoch has done exactly the same. But whereas Hans Glaser is 90% reportage, 10% spin and religious imperative. I think Enoch flips that proportion around. So we've got 10% experience and reportage, 90% interpretation and religious spin. So it's definitely a cocktail of all those things. But at the heart of it is a story of contact with powerful beings who visited in the past. There was a cultural exchange. They taught us stuff, and Enoch, was taken up into the sky by one of them. Now, the reason I think that may have real experience and real history in it is because it correlates with stories to be found elsewhere, and not only in the book of Ezekiel, but in ancestral stories all around the world. Stories of people arriving from space, ancient cheaters, ancient hybridizers, stories from ancient Nigeria, Ghana, the Caribbean, the Philippines, Aboriginal Australia, Papua New Guinea, Wales, Native America, Central America. These are narratives that I explore in my Books in the Eden series, and I believe that setting the Book of Enoch in that context, reading his experience alongside these other narratives, helps us to recognize, there's a core here that is part of a global experience. His interpretation, his religious imperative, well, that might be somewhat unique to the Book of Enoch. But these aspects of visitation, hybridization, ancient tutelage by non-human others, that's an almost universal human story. And it's those correlations that make me listen differently and ask, might there be some history in these stories? Setting Enoch in the context of global origins stories helps us to recognize those themes that are part of a universal experience and those which are part of a local religious interpretation. Those correlations I just mentioned tell us that we can't write off that 10% as the random imaginings of a religious writer. Something else is going on here that merits more serious attention. The similarities of Enoch's experiences with Ezekiel and King Etana and Adapa, and the stories from Nigeria, Ghana, the Philippines, Wales, Aboriginal Australia, Papua New Guinea, Native America, Central America, tell us that our ancestors experienced something that blew them away. They've done their best to describe it to us by analogy, and it's our job now to pay attention and ask exactly what it was they did see.